Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and another video. Today I'm going to show you how I painted these realistic baby feet in my watercolour sketchbook. So I'll be talking about how I chose my watercolours to mix the skin tones and how I added a few final details with my coloured pencils to really make it pop off the page. So make sure to watch to the end and I hope you enjoy the video. All the materials I'm using will be listed in the description box below, along with a reference photo from Pixabay if you want to check those out or maybe try it out for yourself at home. So let's get started. I'm using my Winsor and Newton Professional watercolour paints in pans for a change, and I've picked out a couple of round paintbrushes. So I have a silver black velvet brush in a size 8 and a Princeton snap brush in a size 2. I drew my outline sketch just using a regular HB pencil, and I used a couple of fold back clips to secure my pages. So skin tones come in a huge variety of shades, so there's no one formula that fits all, but I usually start off by spending a few minutes before I begin painting by studying my reference image to see whether the skin tones lean towards more pink, yellow or brown tones for example, and then from that I choose a colour from my palette to use as a base. I also look at where there are soft and hard edges, as this will help me to decide which watercolour techniques to use in the painting. For this painting I chose permanent alizarin crimson and permanent rose, but the wonderful thing about watercolour is that you can work in layers and build up your skin tone gradually, working from light to dark. Obviously this is just my way of doing things, and because skin tones will also reflect the colours in their surroundings, you might also see undertones of green, blue or lilac for example, which you could use to do an underpainting with first if you prefer, but use whatever method works best for you. When I'm painting skin, I like to apply a really light wash first onto the wet paper, so I don't get any hard edges forming at the start, and I add more pigment to the areas in shadow whilst the paper is wet. So I started off with the permanent alizarin crimson and just dropped in a light wash all over the foot, concentrating more pigment into the areas under the toes and round the left side of the foot. At this stage I also added in the suggestion of some of the folds and creases on the foot. These edges are quite soft here, so it's okay that they bleed out on the surface of the wet paper. Whilst this area was still wet, I then used a clean damp brush to lift out any highlights. Once this first foot had dried, I then went in and did the same thing on the second foot. So pre-wetting the paper first with clean water before dropping in some more alizarin crimson. Again, I used more concentrated pigment on the areas in shadow, so that was on the inside of the foot here. I then used a clean damp brush to soften that edge. For the baby's leg, I kept things really light and soft here too, so I used a lot of water to ensure I didn't have any hard edges and just dropped in more pigment on the top of the leg there. Like before, I also added in some darker pigment to the areas in between the toes that were in shadow. Then when I was waiting for the feet to dry, I worked a bit on the background, and for this I just used some really diluted burnt umber. I didn't want too much detail here, as I wanted to focus mainly on the skin tones and the details in the feet. So with that all dry, I decided to then go in and add the darkest tones to my baby's feet. And that's the areas in between the toes and underneath the toes. And for this I switched up to my size 2 round brush. I mixed up some of the permanent rose and added in some sap green. I like to mix my shadow tones using complementary colours, as it makes for a bit more interest in the painting and it's less dull than using just black. So I used my smaller paintbrush just to paint onto dry paper in these really dark areas. I did the same on the other foot, only this time I softened out the edges using clean water on my brush. I also used this same darker colour to emphasise some of the folds in the baby's foot too. Next, once all those darker areas had dried, I went back to my size 8 brush to add my next layer. I'm using the Permanent Rose and Sap Green mix again to tone down some of that pink and give a bit more of a realistic skin tone. And like with my first layer, I pre-wet the paper first on this left side before dropping in paint. I used the same colour and the tip of my brush to darken up the skin creases. I paint in some lighter ones as well, still using the tip of my brush and following the shape of the foot and my reference photo. When it came to the foot on the right for the shadow area, I applied the paint to dry paper as I wanted this area to be darker and I wanted a bit more control so I could leave some highlight areas. But I can still soften out my edges by painting along them with a clean damp brush. I really liked how by adding in the sap green to the Permanent Rose really helped to tone down the bright, less realistic pink tones of my first layer and gave the skin a more natural look, so I used it to layer over the toes and the top of the foot too, being careful to leave in some of the highlight areas. So with the toes done, next it was time to work on the ball of the foot and the folds and creases. Now I'm no expert, but I think the biggest mistake people make when trying to paint creases or wrinkles in skin is to assume that they are solid hard lines, when often, not always, if you look at your reference picture, there is a gradual transition from the darkest to the lightest parts. And not all creases are the same, they will vary in depth too, so some will appear darker than others. So I would suggest looking closely at your reference image, like I said at the start, to see if the edges are hard or soft. And don't go too dark too soon, as it's easier to add colour in watercolour than it is to remove it later. Make sure as well to leave some lighter areas either side of your creases to really help add contrast and depth, which will give your painting a more realistic and natural look. Okay, with that layer dry, I'm mixing up some burnt umber, alizarin crimson and a bit of Winsor violet, and I'm going to apply this to the underside of the right foot. I apply my paint to dry paper but soften out any edges using a clean damp brush. I also mix in a bit of alizarin crimson where the colour transitions from the darkest colour to the lighter, more pink tones. I darken up the shadows in between the toes again next using the same mixture of burnt umber, alizarin crimson and Winsor violet. So at this stage I'm not too unhappy with the painting, but I think the overall colour of the skin is a bit too blue. But that's okay because I can add a glaze over the top to warm it up a bit. For this I'm using burnt umber again mixed with the alizarin crimson I used in the beginning. I apply a fairly dilute wash of this all over the feet, making sure that the previous layers are completely dry first. And whilst the paper is still wet, I add more concentrated pigment back into the shadow areas to maintain the levels of contrast I want. Now I was a lot happier with the overall skin tones, but wanted to redefine the darkest areas in the painting, which is the area under the toes on the left hand foot and the area between the toes on the other side. For this I went back to my size 2 brush and a mixture of alizarin crimson, burnt umber and a tiny bit of black. I also used a bit more burnt umber just to colour up the side of the toes here. Now I could have left the painting there and called it done, but with all of my layering I felt like I'd lost a few of the brightest highlights, so I decided to try and add some of those back in with my coloured pencils. You don't have to do this, but I thought it was easier than trying to re-wet my paper and lift out the highlights again, but it's entirely up to you. If you were painting something to sell, you'd probably have to consider things like light fastness and so on, but this is just a painting in my sketchbook. I used Prismacolor colour pencils today and started off with a sharp white pencil to pull out some of the highlights on the toes. And despite this being a cold pressed paper, as long as the pencils are nice and sharp, you can get a really even coverage. I also used them to add more highlights either side of some of the skin creases, which really helped them to look more realistic. Next, I used a dark purple pencil in the shade Mulberry to further deepen up the darkest shadows in the painting and really make it pop. And you can add as little or as much colour pencil as you like to your painting, it's really up to you. I also used a bit of rose beige and finished off with some clay rose. It was a really fun painting to do and a really good way to practice skin tones without the added complications of eyes, noses and mouths that you'd have if you were practicing skin tones on a face, so I definitely recommend giving it a try. But I'd love to know what you think, so let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this video or found it helpful. If you did like it, then please give it a thumbs up, share it, subscribe if you're not already, and hit the bell icon to be notified as soon as I upload a new video. Thank you so much for watching, take care, have a good weekend, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!